World War II was over. The Nazis were defeated. American soldiers were finally coming home, but thousands of them never made it. They had survived Hitler's prison camps. They had survived years of captivity. They had survived the war itself. And then America's own ally refused to give them back. Joseph Stalin had liberated American prisoners of war from German camps, and then he simply kept them. What happened next, and what one American general was willing to do about it, was buried for decades. This is the story they never told you. To understand what happened, we need to go back to February 1945. The war in Europe was almost over. Adolf Hitler was losing on every front. Allied forces were closing in from the west. Soviet forces were closing in from the east. In this moment, with victory almost certain, the three most powerful men in the world met at a palace on the Black Sea: Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin. The Yalta Conference. Among the many agreements signed at Yalta was one that seemed straightforward at the time. As Soviet forces swept westward through Poland and eastern Germany, they were liberating American and British prisoners of war from German camps. The agreement was simple. Those prisoners would be gathered at collection points, fed, given medical care, and returned to Allied forces as quickly as possible. Stalin signed the agreement. Roosevelt shook his hand. The deal was done. It was never honored. In the winter and spring of 1945, as Soviet forces liberated German prison camps across Eastern Europe, they found thousands of American prisoners of war. These men had been held by the Nazis, some for years. They were starving, sick, desperate to go home. Under the Yalta Agreement, the Soviets were supposed to immediately transfer them to American collection points. Instead, they were loaded onto Soviet trucks and taken east. American military officials began receiving reports. Prisoners who had been confirmed, liberated by Soviet forces, were not arriving at collection points. They were simply disappearing. Washington sent formal requests to Moscow. Stalin's government gave vague answers, delays, excuses. The truth, which American intelligence was beginning to piece together, was deeply alarming. Stalin was holding American prisoners of war in Soviet camps. Some were being interrogated by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. Stalin wanted to know everything about American military capabilities, technology, and plans. Others were simply being used as leverage, bargaining chips in Stalin's growing standoff with the West. American soldiers who had survived years of Nazi captivity were now prisoners of America's own ally. And Washington, desperate to maintain the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union, was doing almost nothing about it. There was one American general who was not willing to stay quiet: General George S. Patton. Patton was already a legend by 1945, commander of the Third Army, the most aggressive, most successful American ground commander of the entire war. A man who had driven his forces further and faster than anyone thought possible. He was also a man who did not trust Joseph Stalin. While diplomatic cables were being exchanged between Washington and Moscow, while politicians were talking and nothing was happening, Patton was looking at maps. His Third Army was positioned deep in Central Europe. Soviet forces were to the east, and somewhere between them, American soldiers were being held against their will. Patton made a decision that his superiors would never have authorized. He sent his own men, small, fast units, into the Soviet zone of operations. Their mission was simple: find American prisoners and bring them back. These were not official operations. They were not authorized by Washington. They were not coordinated with the Soviets. Patton simply sent his soldiers to get their fellow Americans and let the diplomats figure out the paperwork later. In several documented incidents, American units made direct contact with Soviet forces holding American prisoners. The confrontations were tense. Weapons were raised, nobody fired, but in each case, the American prisoners were released. Patton was furious at what he saw. American soldiers, allies, being held like enemies. He made his feelings known loudly and repeatedly to his superiors, and his superiors told him to be quiet. The alliance with the Soviet Union was more important than any individual soldiers. Patton disagreed. How many American prisoners of war were held by the Soviets after World War II? The official answer for decades was very few. A minor misunderstanding quickly resolved. The real answer is far more disturbing. Researchers who gained access to Soviet archives after the fall of the Soviet Union found evidence of thousands of American prisoners passing through Soviet hands in 1945. Some were eventually returned after months of delays and diplomatic pressure.